What's up, everyone? It's Dakota, and welcome back to another Modern video. And with the next few months of the competitive season being focused on the Modern format, of course, we know all about the looming bans, as you know, Wizards has all but announced the banning of Nadu without doing it essentially an emergency ban on Nadu, and all the kind of controversy that kind of swirls around that sort of sector of Magic. We're here today to kind of go over the two parts of this Modern RCQ season, where we're going to have a few weeks of Nadu decks flying around, you know, potentially dominating your local events, depending on if people have already kind of bought into it, maybe some gentlemen's agreements, things like that going on. But we're going to take a look at the Modern format. We're going to kind of analyze it. We're going to look at some deck lists from decks that are currently performing well kind of in this Nadu format. We're going to look at some decks I think can do well post Nadu, and in general just kind of give you some advice to hopefully crush your RCQ and get you qualified for either that regional championship in Portland, Oregon, or in Charlotte, North Carolina, or heck, maybe even both if you feel so inclined to do so. I think with them being kind of on like polar opposites of the United States, I think it's going to be a lot harder for, I would say, the majority of people to kind of go to one month and then the very next month go to the one in Charlotte. But, you know, whatever the case may be, you can try to qualify for both of them now under this new system, and potentially, I guess in theory, like double your chances of getting qualified for the Pro Tour or maybe even the World Championship if you're so lucky to make it to the finals of either of those regional championships. Of course, before we get too deep into the video and we talk about the Modern format, the ins and outs, and get you prepared for the Modern RCQ season, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me, where I focus mainly on the Modern Pioneer format, as well as some longer form videos. So if any of that interests you, please consider subscribing, ring the notification bell, so you know when videos get posted. We are so close to 1,000 subscribers. We are trying to absolutely obliterate our goal. We are trying to hit it by the end of the year, and it looks like we're going to hit it well before then. The community is awesome. Y'all are awesome. Let's keep crushing it, and I'll keep putting out these videos and trying to help you qualify for your regional championship that you would wish to attend to. With all that said, let's go ahead, check out the Modern format, and kind of do some talking. So just some in general tips to kind of keep in mind when preparing for this regional championship qualifying season. You do not absolutely have to play Modern if you don't want to. There are stores that are putting on sealed events. The sealed events I personally enjoy playing in. I think they're a lot of fun, kind of like challenges your deck building a little bit, your understanding of the format and things like that. So it's something that I personally enjoy doing, and I'm definitely going to be doing at least one or two of them in this current season. But if you are looking to play Modern, one of the best things that you can do, and I will always like preach and harp on it above anything else, if you do anything else, or this is the only thing that you do rather from any of the things that I tell you, it's to practice playing your deck. It sounds stupid. It sounds like it should be like a, oh, I didn't think of that situation, but really that's the best thing that you can do, whether it's just playing the deck against like nonsensical stuff that maybe like your friends into playing, or if you actually have like testing buddies that you can play with and, you know, test out certain matchups and everything like that. I think your own personal experience, you'll find, ends up helping out very, very much. And if you aren't able to play, I would say the next best thing you can do is try to watch videos and watch other people kind of break down the decks that you're playing, kind of help to understand better maybe the role of certain cards in certain matchups, or just in the role in the deck period, and help you to kind of understand maybe the situations you might find yourself in to kind of then explore on your own to figure out a lot better. I just think personal experience and kind of you going through the motions of doing it is a lot more helpful than someone telling you, but I think that either one can be very beneficial to you than just obviously doing nothing and going kind of into your event blind with a deck that you may have just picked up, you know, a few days ago, which I would say for some decks, you need to have at least just the slightest bit of understanding of what's going on. I think that's why even some people who kind of take like these weird brews that, you know, are relatively, I mean, obviously they played it a bunch. It has to be good against some of the things in the format. And I think that's where, you know, people not being prepared prepared, on top of you being, you know, at a point like over prepared for what's going on, that you can kind of end up winning games or even matches that maybe necessarily like in a vacuum you wouldn't have won with like that outside assistance of just, you know, having a lot more information than what your opponent has. So definitely the two things I would harp on the most when preparing for these regional championship qualifying tournaments is just to prepare. I don't think you can necessarily be over prepared. If you're playing, you know, like one of the meta decks, there's plenty of other content creators out there that have put together like sideboard guides on why exactly you bring in certain cards, why you take out certain cards that you do, kind of these fine-tuned deck lists, everything like that. I mean, the resources are out there. If you want to win a regional championship qualifier bad enough and you want to perform well at them at the very least, there are, you know, plenty of videos out there going over a lot of the other meta decks that you could potentially play, and off meta decks as well that maybe you see from people like Doomwake or Aspiring Spike, whatnot, that you can kind of pick up and play, and, you know, just fun decks that are going to do well in the format that, again, people might not be very familiar with, that can kind of help you to get some percentage points in your direction. Again, just you having an understanding of what is going on, and maybe a better understanding of like a certain matchup than kind of what your opponent has going on with what you have going on. So I think those are the pretty big, important things to kind of harp on, that no matter what, whether you're playing in a Nadu RCQ or a potential non-Nadu RCQ, I think those kind of tips are very important. They seem like they should just be like no-brainers, but people just don't do them. They go into them blind. They think that, you know, oh, I've played enough, and it turns out like you haven't. There are tons of really, really good players out there that are playing in regional championship qualifiers, that they might not be the best players in the world, but they are certainly really, really good players that you cannot underestimate. You have to go in at the very least prepared. Whether, you know, some people can just sit around and play Magic for, you know, 6, 8, 10, 12 hours a day, and they have all this information, they have all these reps, and, you know, they're fully prepared. They just basically have to hope that they run halfway decent, where for some people, like even like myself, where I can't really play that much every single day, that you have to try to find your edges somewhere. And I think that's, you know, maximizing your time trying to fully prepare. And I think all the previously stated actions are going to help you to at least feel kind of prepared. Maybe you're still a little nervous, things like that. Either way, like, you're going to kind of go in with some format knowledge. You're going to go in with deck knowledge. And if you're a pretty astute player and you're kind of like receptive to what is going on, you can kind of make decisions on the fly. And then, of course, kind of analyze those decisions when you go back to the drawing board and figure out like, okay, maybe this wasn't really all that great in this particular matchup, maybe next time, or like you can kind of play it out and just like, okay, well, what if I did this time and then they still did that, or this, things like that. No, that's just all like the growing pains of becoming not necessarily a professional Magic player, but becoming a better Magic player in general, to get to the path of playing on the Pro Tour and maybe even a World Championship one day. And kind of my thought process on breaking down information is just trying to get better as a player in kind of the moment to make those decisions. And I think one of the ways to better make those decisions is to get out and play, whether it's with your friends, whether it's at these tournaments, to, again, try to give yourself the best opportunity to qualify for a regional championship, qualify for a Pro Tour, and potentially even qualify for Worlds as well. With all that said, of course, that's kind of like my thoughts, tips, tricks, ideas, etc. Let's go ahead. Let's check out some deck lists. Let's kind of analyze the modern format currently and kind of make some predictions on where it could go in a potentially post-Nadu world here. So we're going to run through some of the decks that you're very likely to see and kind of work our way down to some of the more, the least likely versions of the deck that you're going to see. But we're going to kind of go through them. We're going to kind of break down exactly what they have going on. If you want to see like a tier list of some sort, kind of all these decks kind of thrown together and where I kind of rank them currently and where they could be, you know, in after, you know, the potential bannings. I do have a tier list that I did a few days ago. If you want to check that out, I can link it in the description down below, or you can subscribe to my channel and then go to my channel and you can see the video too. That'd be really sweet. But first, we're going to start with Bant Nadu. This is the boogeyman of the format. This is the best. This is the best deck, period. I mean, if you want to win your regional championship qualifier and you want there to be no doubt that you're playing the best deck in the format, this is the best deck. The only problem is that it is very likely to be banned. This card, Nadu Winged Wisdom, turns out to be a busted magic card, and for this deck in particular, it is able to use it to great effect. Such great effect that literally there's just a bunch of different ways that you can end the game with this deck, and it even has continued to evolve just a little bit in the margins. But the idea is that you play this card, Nadu Winged Wisdom. It's going to give creatures that you control that whenever they become the target of a spell or ability, you reveal the top card of your library. If it's a land, you put it on the battlefield. Otherwise, you put it in your hand, and this ability triggers only twice each turn. The problem is that it only triggers twice each turn for each creature, not just twice each turn, period. So if you have a Nadu Winged Wisdom in play, basically you get to look at 2 cards with every creature that you have, thanks to Outrider Encore having a 0-cost ability that allows you to target, essentially, like the next 1 damage that would be dealt to Outrider Encore this turn is dealt to target creature you control instead. Doesn't really matter, because Outrider Encore is just there to essentially target something. It also has like the added benefit of being a creature, so you can get it off like Court of Calling. You can Finale of Devastation for it even as well, is like a way to kind of go and get it in play, and then with Nadu start triggering things, and you can do this at instant speed, where Shuko is the preferred method because you can get it off of things like Urza Saga, and it costs 1 mana as well, so when you're playing all these mana dorks, you're able to kind of curve into it kind of nicely, where you can play like a Springheart and Tuco and a Shuko on turn 2 to follow it up with like a Nadu on turn 3. Then you have essentially, like with land drops, you have tokens that you can be made from it, and continue to kind of like target and go off and hope to go off the Springheart and Tuco. So kind of the things that you're looking for when you are playing this deck, you want to get a Nadu down with a Shuko or an Outrider Encore. Outrider Encore is, I would say, technically better because you can get all your targets out of the way, no matter how many pieces of interaction that your opponent has, where Shuko is more susceptible because Equip is a sorcery speed thing. That if your opponent can't interact, Shuko is the best one because it does fit on the curve a little bit better and has a few different ways that you can actually search for it. But if your opponent is able to play something like a Fatal Push, then you're only more than likely going to get 2 activations or 2 triggers from Nadu, giving the ability to your creatures in that turn, which is still pretty good for the fact that you didn't really invest any mana into it, and your opponent invested cards and mana into kind of disrupting it. But nonetheless, obviously the idea is to go off. So what does going off look like? You have a Nadu in play. You have like your Shuko, your Outrider Encore. If you have like, I would say 3 or 4 creatures in play, I would say is like a safe bet that you can kind of go off with that, especially if you have a Springheart and a Tuco in play. So Springheart says whenever your land enters the battlefield, you can pay 1 and a green, and if it's attached to a creature, you make a token that's a copy of that creature. If you didn't make a token this way, you create a 1/1 green insect creature token. So while you're going through with this, Nadu's ability is going to put lands into play if you reveal them. So when you put a land into play, you're going to trigger the Springheart and Tuco to make a creature, which means that you essentially get 2 more looks at cards. And the idea is that you kind of go through enough cards, you eventually find like a Court of Calling. You can Court of Calling, and either, if you're getting close, you can just go and Court of Calling for like another Nadu. Because for some reason, if you legend rule the old Nadu and then you keep the new one around, it just resets all of the triggers. So you get to basically trigger each creature twice each turn over again with another copy of Nadu. Of course, casting it's a little bit better because you want to leave your Court of Callings for some of your other creatures in here. Like you can go and get something like a Sylvan Safekeeper, and if you have like the Endurance in hand, or if you're looking for either one of these, then the combination of these 2 plus having a Springheart and Tuco on the Endurance allows you to loop through your deck, float a ton of mana. And then this deck in particular has a different kind of win condition where, yes, you can Beseiju all your opponent's non-basic lands, all their, enchantments, things like that with Endurance. I believe this deck is actually not playing an Otawara, so it's even just kind of going past kind of the loop, where before you would have an Otawara in this deck list and a Boseiju, and then you could put a bunch of lands back in your deck thanks to sacrificing them with Sylvan Safekeeper. You would technically get Nadu triggers as well if you targeted something that had triggers available to trigger. And with Endurance, you're able to put those lands into play. You're able to create a copy of the Endurance because you enchanted it with a Spring Heart and Antuco, and then shuffle those lands back in and kind of continue to do it. You can float a ton of mana and get to a point where you can like cast Boseijus and blow up your opponent's lands. And then Otawaras, you could bounce all of your other opponents' like permanents and pass the turn with a board full of 1/1s and Endurances. This deck can essentially kind of do the same thing where you do the Safekeeper plus Endurance thing. You end up floating a ton of mana. You bounce, like you sacrifice all the lands. You create a copy of the Endurance with one of the triggers on the stack. And then you shuffle all the lands back in, and then you can cast a Finale of Devastation for a lot. You search your library and or graveyard for a creature with mana value X or less, put it on the battlefield. If X is 10 or greater, creatures you control get +X/+X and gain haste until end of turn. So when you're kind of going through this loop and you're making, 1 or 2 copies of Endurances through this loop, and of course you're making then like, we'll say like 5 or 6 insects, and you do this, I don't know, like 3 or 4 times, you have more than likely have enough creatures on the battlefield and have the ability to make enough creatures on the battlefield to where you can just, overrun your opponent with a bunch of big creatures. Of course, like Nadu also having like flying is allowing it to be pretty evasive as well. I guess Volatile Stormdrake, more than likely you're kind of giving it away. But this is like an option that you can win the game relatively quickly. There are some lists that are playing this in paper, I believe, but online has definitely adopted this because going through that loop is a little bit easier online to generate, 20, 30 mana to make X equal 10 or 20 or even 30 versus trying to win with Thassa's Oracle, which makes your deck arguably worse because it's considered the training wheels of the deck, or doing the Boseiju plus Otawara loop to where you essentially give your opponent a turn and the potential to, have them win the game, usually with something like Rakdos Charm. But normally, now with Finale of Devastation, you can just win the game, and it fits into the game plan of kind of getting you a Nadu, getting you Outrider Encore. Even if one of them has died or ended up in the graveyard, Finale of Devastation conveniently lets you go to the graveyard to go get those creatures. So definitely a card that, like I said, fits into the game plan, especially with Malevolent Rumble anyway. Also puts the rest of the cards in your graveyard, so Malevolent Rumble can kind of help you with Finale of Devastation to, maybe mill a potential creature that you need, or if you end up milling it and you don't want to put like that card into your hand, you can leave it in the graveyard, and Finale of Devastation can get it back later. So like tips of playing against this deck, don't. Hope that you can avoid the Nadu matchup. There is some decks that kind of have some things going on, and we'll kind of explain some of the other popular archetypes that are being played that, have some theoretical spots where it is better than Nadu. But by and large, this deck just has way too much consistency between Summoner's Pact that's able to go and get green creatures, which means that you have access to Nadu with 2 Summoner's Pact, technically a Finale Devastation, 4 Card Calling, and the 4 Nadu. And then, like the Shuko, you end up having Urza Saga. You just have the Shuko, period. You have the Outrider Encore that can get got with the Finale of Devastation, the Quarter Calling as well. And just on top of all these other disruptive things, you have a Sun Cleanser for the energy decks, which is going to be important for more like Jeskai Control, and has some applications against the Boros Energy deck where you can kind of put them in some awkward spots. Volatile Stormdrake for the mirror matches where you can kind of steal maybe your opponent's ramp or even their own Nadu and pay to kind of keep it around. You can, like Wall of Roots ends up being like a very good blocker that's also going to generate a ton of mana over the course of however many turns. Plus is really neat to use with Quarter Calling because you can activate the ability and tap it to pay for the Convoke cost. Even if it has 4 counters on it already and you would place the 5th one on it, there is a trick where if you announce the casting of like Quarter Calling, you can add mana and then also Convoke with the Wall of Roots as well before it would end up actually going to the graveyard. This deck just has a ton of, even like Springheart and Antuco being a piece that can kind of protect itself by putting it on a creature, because of Bestow, if it would become unattached to something, to the creature that's enchanted to, it just falls off and it becomes its own creature. So you can like protect Springheart and Antuco from like your opponent's removal spells in that way as well. On top of course, having like the combo implications of putting out like on an endurance and then just kind of getting to loop through your deck, make a ton of tokens, and then kill your opponent with Finale of Devastation. This deck is a well-oiled machine. I've said it it feels like at least 1 or 2 videos a week. This is unequivocally the best deck in the Modern format. It's not even competing for being the best deck in the Modern format currently. It can compete with, some of the best Modern decks of all time in terms of some of the stats that it's managed to put up. The fact that it has been kind of a known quantity since the card Nadu has been spoiled, and everybody knew, and maybe it might start out as a joke, but people knew that this deck was going to be amazing going into the Modern season, and it has only gotten better and better. Quarter of the decks in the Pro Tour ended up having 5 copies in the top 8, which translated to, I think, even, over half of the top 16 decks being Nadu. And, of course, winning the tournament, all copies, all 4 out of 5 copies being in the top 4. It's done a lot. And the fact that, usually when a deck has a pretty high metagame share, its win-loss record shows because obviously it's playing against itself, which means that it loses. But this deck had a non-mirror win rate of almost 60% at the Pro Tour. Continues to put up to the mid to high 50s in kind of those non-mirror match, and even in the mid to high 50s, I'm assuming even with playing mirror matches, which is absolutely insane. So unless somehow, some way, Nadu players are just very good at dodging each other in the Swiss rounds of events, but we've seen plenty of 10Ks in things like that hosted by Star City Games and NRG, where Nadu has absolutely dominated in some of the higher tiers of Magic that, it's only inevitable that this deck is not going to exist anymore. But if you are looking to win in RCQ, I would say pick up Nadu, practice it a bunch, understand your loops, understand the situations where you want to go get some of your one-of creatures, maybe even tool your deck a little bit more to where if you're not seeing a lot of these energy decks, or even if you don't expect there to be a lot of Nadu and stuff. I think Volatile Stormdrake anyway is kind of just a good card to have in general. But, there's plenty of other things going on here that you can, if you can play this deck, play it. I would not, sell the farm to go build this deck to qualify because it is not going to be legal for very long. But if you know some people that are willing to let you borrow most or all of the deck, I think it's worth playing in at least 1 or 2 tournaments because it's the best Modern deck, period, by far. Play it if you can. Don't stress out if you can't, because there are a few decks that I think have some spots, again, where they perform pretty well against the Nadu deck, and we're going to be going over them next. But I feel like it was very important to talk about the boogeyman of the format, kind of understand why it's so good currently and why it's going to be good for the entirety of the RCQ season, which is going to be about 3 to 4 weeks for it. So let's go ahead and take a look at the deck that I think is probably the only deck in the format that could reasonably make an argument that it has a good Nadu matchup. So let's go ahead and take a look at Jeskai Control next. So next here we have Jeskai Control. As I alluded to before the transition, this is the deck that can argue that it has a decent to fairly good Nadu matchup, and it's thanks to some of these energy cards that we see in the Modern format from the new Modern Horizons 3 set. Get out of here, Z-Bar. So this deck in particular is a big benefit from having these energy cards in the format. Galvanic Discharge has proven to be a very good removal spell. 1 mana, you get 3 energy. You choose a target creature, a planeswalker, and then you pay any amount of energy, and it deals that much damage to that permanent. So by itself, this can deal up to 3 damage to something, which is not anything out of the ordinary. We have a bunch of cards that have some of these conditions to where it can deal 3 damage, but certain conditions have to be met. Galvanic Discharge, you just have to be able to target something to be able to do the damage, and you do any amount of damage, which means that if you only need to deal 1 damage, then you have 2 energy stored up. We have 2 in the narrative that's going to let you draw a card and get 2 energy, so this is going to let you kind of go through your deck a little bit, put cards into the graveyard for some other cards that are going to be important later. And finally, the most important card, Wrath of the Skies, which this is important because as you're Galvanic Discharging, your opponent's Delighted Halfling, and you have an energy stored up, then you play a 2 in the narrative, now all of a sudden you have 3 energy. Well, now you have 3 energy, and of course Amazon Prime is going to give me the unblockable ad, so you win this time, Goldfish. So Wrath of the Skies is the big important card that I think kind of tips the scales in the Jeskai player's favor. As you're kind of interacting with the Nadu deck, you kill their 1-drop creature, again, you have like the energy kind of stored up. Maybe you end up killing another one, or you end up casting like a counter spell. You have, 1 or 2 energy kind of stored up. You get to your next turn, like we'll say turn 3, you have an energy or 2 stored up. Your opponent, basically puts the combo on the table. Their Urza Saga is about to go off to go get their Shuko. And then you cast Wrath of the Skies, where you can just pay 3 mana. You end up getting an energy, and then you can pay 3 energy and destroy each artifact, creature, enchantment with a mana value less than or equal to the number of energy paid this way, meaning that you can Wrath their board. And of course, you have things like Force and Negation that you can interact on your opponent's turn, since you're tapped out. They might try to Quarter Calling, or maybe Hour of Devastation to try to bring something back, and then you're able to kind of Force Negation, pitching a blue card. In a lot of scenarios, ideally, you're able to disrupt them to the point where maybe they're able to go off, and it's turn 4, turn 5, you've hit your land drops. You can Wrath of the Skies for 2 mana, and then you have 3 mana left up, so you can leave up something like Invert Polarity. You can leave up Counterspell plus 2 in the narrative, Counterspell plus Galvanic Discharge. You can leave up plenty of things to do in kind of that scenario to make life on your opponent very hard. And with the Nadu deck, sometimes really wanting to play at instant speed to just kind of make sure that it can get the creatures it needs on the battlefield. You can even play a Teferi Time Raveler, which this is actually a really sweet art from the Bloomburrow Commander set. I actually absolutely love that. If anybody plays a Teferi Time Raveler against me, I'm going to carry around bird Teferi Time Ravelers just so people have to play with this one, because I refuse to play against the other ones, because that is sick. But making your opponents only be able to cast spells anytime they can cast sorcery, while giving your sorcery spells flash, is very powerful. I mean, we've talked about even just playing a Wrath of the Skies for as cheap as it is. This allows you then to pay 5 mana for it and store up even more energy to make future Wrath of the Skies better, to make Galvanic Discharges, be able to take down bigger creatures. It's just in general lines up decently well with what Nadu's going on. It's not the end all be all, because again, the Nadu players can kind of get you into these situations where you have to deal with multiple things at a time. And I think in the very early turns of the game, it's very important to have your Galvanic Discharges, be able to play your Tune the Narratives, and be able to counterspell and Wrath of the Skies the correct things, and learn to Force and Negation when necessary. The One Ring is obviously going to help down a lot. Dress Down is also a card that we have not seen for quite a while, where it enters the battlefield to draw a card, creatures lose all abilities in the beginning, end step you sacrifice Dress Down. So this is kind of a way that you can on your opponent's end step, you can Dress Down, and then you can play a Flage if you need to. This is going to stop it from entering the battlefield, so you're not going to get to Lightning Helix anything, but you're also not going to trigger, the clause on it that has to sacrifice it unless it was escape. So you just have a 6/6 on turn 3 that, on your next turn, presumably, you're going to be able to attack with it and start Lightning Helixing your opponent's things. While not necessarily a Nadu thing, but can be pretty good, because then you're able to attack, you're able to pick off some of the dorks. Kind of helps you, again, with things like Galvanic Discharge, because you could just get essentially between Flage and Galvanic Discharge, get rid of 2 creatures instead of Galvanic Discharge kind of being overloaded in a way on trying to figure out which one is the best one to get rid of. This is also going to kind of put a clock on your opponent as well, to kind of force them to go off maybe a little bit sooner than they're either able to or than they want to. Continuing even further, Lorien Revealed here, Island Cycling, even in the late game, just 5 mana draw 3 is fine, kind of when you're in these top deck wars, and people have kind of found out that it is pretty good. And of course, the benefit of Teferi Time Raveler as well, giving it flash, meaning that you can end up on your opponent's end step, paying 5 mana to draw 3 cards, and they really can't interact with it in any meaningful way. Arena of Glory, because I just the red manland from the red manland from the D&D adventure set, the Den of the Bugbear, where I feel every time I have to announce that if you activate it multiple times, you end up getting multiple goblins when you attack with it. Arena of Glory is here specifically for the the escape cost of Flage, because if you pay the escape cost by exerting the Arena of Glory, you're going to give it haste, and you're going to be able to, not only Lightning Helix, one of your opponent's creatures, and then you're going to be able to attack and then do it again. This is like a way that in like those top deck situations where you can get back a Flage and then, put your opponent really on, put the screws to them, because you're going to essentially hit them for 12 and then gain 6 life. And aside from being kind of like these combo decks, Flage is going to make it very hard for your opponent to win any sort of race, where it's going to have to start with dealing with the Flage. And of course, as like the control player, you have plenty of different ways to kind of protect it, and then also, kind of outcard advantage your opponent thanks to the One Ring or Lorien Revealed. We see like Manamo School's Edge is like a pretty neat card in here. Of course, it's off to the side. You can pay a blue and tap it to untap target legendary permanent. Who knew that the One Ring is a legendary artifact? Nobody, because everyone plays fucking 4 copies of this card in their deck. You can use Manamo to untap it, and then of course tap it to draw more cards. This is like a way that, when you go to play like your third counter on it, you draw 3 cards, and then you end up untapping and drawing 4 cards. You drew 7 cards and took 4 damage, and with people playing like Necro Dominance and paying 7 life to draw 7 cards, and people playing Yawgmoth Bargain and Necropotence, they're essentially having to pay a life for a card. The fact that thanks to Manamo, the One Ring is going to have you draw like 1.25 cards or whatever for every life, which is going to, obviously when you're drawing a lot of cards like that, is going to be really sweet. I mean, I would definitely draw a whole new grip of cards for life with any deck, any given day. There's some pretty cool sideboard cards in here as well. We didn't go over them in like the Nadu deck, because honestly, who fucking cares? Like Obsidian Charmaw against like the Tron decks has been a card that has seen more play, especially with like Ugin's Labyrinth as well. You can kind of snipe a Labyrinth before they're able to bring the card back to their hand. That's essentially a lost card for them. Consign to Memory is like a way that you can counter a triggered ability or counter a colorless spell for 1 blue mana, and then you can pay 1 generic mana to replicate it and essentially get more triggered abilities. This is kind of like an anti-storm measure, on top of also just being a pretty good card against some of the Eldrazi Tron decks that are more than likely going to pop up after a Nadu ban, because Tron usually seems to kind of show up after that. You have Drannith Magistrate is like some Storm Hate. You have Narset Parter Avails for like those decks that just want to draw a bunch of cards via like the One Ring basically. Mystical Dispute is the potential to be a really good a cheap counterspell. And Invert Polarity is just like another counterspell that you could potentially gain control of a spell and like steal your opponent's like One Ring. You can steal their Escape Flages. That seems pretty good to me. In the worst case, you counter it. In the best case, you end up taking that card. So pretty neat there as well. Supreme Verdict is also just being a countervolt Wrath. We talked about Wrath of the Skies. You're going to need that energy build up to be able to do it on the early turn. So like Supreme Verdict is just a clean, easy way. Can't be countered, destroy all creatures, the classics. This deck in particular, I think a lot of control decks take a lot of skill to play, and I think Jeskai Control, with the things it has going on, I think are just in general good against the format. It just so happens that Nadu is the best thing to do in the format, and I think Jeskai Control's threats, or rather their answers, kind of line up with their threats pretty well. Obviously, still, Nadu is the best deck in the format. Jeskai Control theoretically has a good Nadu matchup. I have yet to really see that kind of unfold, but it does have a lot of tools that I like, that are very, kind of reactive and receptive to what the Nadu player is doing and what Jeskai Control has and how it can close out the game, because it was really missing a way to kind of close out the game that would also kind of help it in like the early to mid game, and it got Flage and it has all these other energy payoffs. So I think in general Jeskai Control is in a very good spot in Modern currently. I think it's a fine deck to play in a Nadu format. I think it's probably one of the best decks you can play in a Nadu format, especially if you're used to playing control decks. And I think going forward it's also a very strong choice, just because it has a lot of bit for everything. And it's still, I think Control was like maybe on the fringe of being playable, and with all these cards added to it, I think it's going to be at least a solid, like at worst, probably like a tier 1.5 deck. Like it's still going to be a deck that if you know what's going on in the format and you know what's going on in Jeskai Control and you can properly assess threats, you're always going to be able to have success with Jeskai Control in the Modern format as it stands right now. Maybe that changes as we go down the road into the qualifying season, but as of right now, if I had to make a decision on Jeskai Control, I would say it's solidly a tier 1 deck, and I think only gets better with the better the pilot you are behind it. So that's Jeskai Control. There's another popular energy deck, of course, that we have to take a look at. So let's go ahead and hop over to the Boros Energy deck. So here we have Boros Energy. There is 2 different variants of this. There's a Mardu one, there's a Boros one. I think the Mardu one plays a little bit more like Chthonian Nightmare, and the Orcish Bowmaster, you can kind of like loop them and kind of do some pretty neat stuff with that, on top of course, all the normal Boros stuff as well that you get to do with Chthonian Nightmare. But in general, I think the Boros Energy version has been the most popular one. It's got the easiest mana base, so it's kind of hard to get like mana screwed, even though there is ways, and we'll kind of get to how that can happen in a minute. Ocelot Pride being a pretty late addition to the deck, even though at this rate now it's been in the deck for a little bit. Not nearly as long. It's not as tenured as some of these other cards, but Ocelot Pride with Guide of Souls is pretty neat, with Guide of Souls being a very much amped up Soul Sister. It's going to get you energy into life whenever another creature enters the battlefield, and then whenever you attack, the Guide of Souls doesn't have to attack. Whenever you just attack with a creature, you can pay 3 energy. If you do, you put 2+1/+1 counters and a flying on target attacking creature, and then it becomes an angel, kind of whatever. Ocelot Pride, if you have a Guide of Souls on turn 1, you play like an Ocelot Pride on turn 2, then, if you've gained life this turn, you make a 1/1 cat, and then if you have the City's Blessing, which means you have to have 10 or more permanents on the battlefield to get the City's Blessing, as long as you have like an Ascend creature or permanent or something on it when you have 10 permanents. If you have the City's Blessing, then you enter the battlefield, you create a token that's a copy of it. Also note that like some of the Mardu decks will get the City's Blessing. They have an Ocelot Pride in play, or multiple Ocelot Prides, that they're now playing the Omnixilus that has the Casualty ability that allows you to sack a creature and then make a copy of it. So then, when the Ocelot Pride start triggering, well, you've already created a token of Omnixilus, so then the Ocelot Pride will then make a copy of all those tokens, meaning that you'll have another Omnixilus. And then if you have another Ocelot Pride, then you'll have, essentially 5 Omnixiluses on the battlefield, which is pretty insane. But in this deck, you're able to make a huge army full of cats, which is pretty good when we look at our next cat in Ajani Nakatl Pariah, where if we're able to flip it for another cat dying, we are able to put +1/+1 counters on each cat you control, and of course 0 to make a 2/1 cat soldier or cat warrior token, and then deal damage if we have another red permanent other than a Johnny. He'll deal damage equal to the number of creatures you control to any target. So this is something that we can go to the face if we have something like a Ragavan, an Amp Raptor, Bone Crusher Giant, or a Flage on the battlefield, even a Blood Moon or a Fable the Mirror Breaker, even the token from Fable as well. This deck is able to use its energy in a different way from the Jeskai Control decks, where we're seeing the energy kind of spent on Amp Raptor, which is a 2-mana 2/1 first strike. It enters the battlefield, you get 2 energy, and if you cast it from your hand, you exile cards from the top of your library. 2, you exile a non-land card, and then you may cast a card by paying any amount of energy equal to its mana value rather than paying its mana cost. So with a Guide of Souls on turn 1, Amp Raptor on turn 2, you're able to cast anything that comes off the top of your deck. Flage is a little embarrassing just because it doesn't get to stick around, but when you get to turn 2 Blood Moon your opponent, or get to play like a Fable the Mirror Breaker after you played an Amp Raptor, you're going to gain another life from the Guide of Souls. While you spent all your energy, you kind of get an energy back from that because of the Fable token entering the battlefield, and of course on turn 3 you're going to be able to trigger the second chapter on a Fable, ideally discard some cards, draw some cards that are going to be pretty bad in the matchup. Boros sort of plays like this mid-range deck, but it can close out the game very quickly. I would say that it against like Nadu, it doesn't want to play a long game against it. It wants to get in, it wants to do its damage, it wants to kind of get it in range for an Ajani, blast to the face, or just make a ton of cat tokens, beef them up with Ajani Nakatl Avengers +2 ability, and then maybe like minus. Oh, shoot, where'd you go? And then minus to make them choose an artifact, creature, enchantment, or a planeswalker, and then sacrifice the rest of the permanents, so then you can get in with your army of cats and beat down your opponent for lethal, which is actually really cool with Ajani because you're able to +2 it. If you have like 10 cats in play, they're all going to get +1/+1 counters on it, and then you're able to kind of do like the tragic arrogance kind of thing to your opponent, where you're going to make them sacrifice a whole bunch of things, and then your cats are be able to get in and deal lethal damage there. Bone Crusher Giant has this neat thing on the stomp side of it where damage can't be prevented this turn, and protection, ding ding ding, prevents damage. So if you Bone Crusher Giant like yourself or one of your creatures or one of your opponent's creatures, and they have one ring protection, they no longer have one ring protection. So Bone Crusher Giant is able to go. Obviously, they have protection before you cast the Bone Crusher Giant, so you're still not able to target them, but you're able to attack, and the damage can't be prevented. Plus, it's also just an annoying, like a 3-mana 4/3 beats down pretty nicely as well. Flage makes another appearance here, closes out games very quickly for Jeskai Control, and essentially can do the same thing for the Boros Energy deck. We see Galvanic Discharge here, along with something like Static Prison, which is going to exile non-land permanent opponent controls until it leaves the battlefield. You're going to get 2 energy, and then at the beginning of your pre-combat main phase, you're going to sacrifice it unless you pay an energy. This is really neat because a lot of these effects used to be in the upkeep. So with this being pre-combat main phase, you're actually able to draw your card and kind of get just that little bit more information before you get to decide if the Static Prison gets to stick around or if you're going to keep it around. Of course, with Guide of Souls and Galvanic Discharges, you can just keep Static Prison around for virtually forever, with enough creatures that you can kind of get the Guide of Souls going, or just, again, pay the energy into the Guide of Souls to make your creatures even better, take to the skies, and beat your opponent down. Here, again, we see Arena of Glory, again, being this thing that this deck can leverage a little bit better. While the Jeskai Control had like a few creatures where, yes, technically you can use Arena of Glory to give them haste, they're not really all that great. Again, giving to Flage is kind of awesome. Going for Bone Crusher Giant, going into Amped Raptor, especially with like Guide of Souls in play, or even like Ocelot Pride, again, with like Guide of Souls as well. Even Jangotha, a 5/5 like haste creature, hits pretty dang hard in the modern format. When you're kind of in these late game situations where you and your opponent are kind of like hoping to kind of draw out of a pseudo stalemate, if you will. This deck as well, Blood Moon is still a house in the format. Non-basic lands are mountains, and for this deck, obviously, it plays a lot of red cards. You just Blood Moon your opponent on turn 2 off of like an Amp Raptor. If you have like 1 plains in play, you're just not going to be able to bring back the Flage, but you're able to cast and play everything else in your deck while your opponent struggles to get rid of the Blood Moon, which is like still away here in 2024. You can get some free easy wins. Some notable cards here in the sideboard. We have Harsh Mentor. Is kind of the big one that these red decks play, that whenever an opponent activates an ability of an artifact, creature, or a land on the battlefield, if it isn't a mana ability, Harsh Mentor deals 2 damage to that player. If they try to activate a fetch land, they try to activate the 0 ability of Outrider on Core, they try to activate the 0 ability on a Shuko, they try to really do anything. If they activate an ability on any of their creatures, they just end up taking 2 damage, and it's only an opponent, so you don't have to worry about, if you didn't crack your fetch land beforehand or activate Arena of Glory, or actually Arena of Glory is a mana ability. Either case, Harsh Mentor can punish your opponent, and they're going to have to figure out a way to play through the Harsh Mentor to end up going off. If they're like the Nadu player, of course we have Sun Cleanser, because even for the Jeskai Control decks, they're able to kind of like wipe the board pretty easily with a lot of the tokens that this deck plays. So Sun Cleanser, actually they're still going to be able to wipe away the tokens, but they're not going to be able to get rid of the Ocelot Prides, which is going to be able to stack tokens back up again. The 4th copy of Blood Moon, Bone Crusher Giant, and Wear Tear. This deck, I think, is poised post Nadu to be the best deck. I think Nadu is the only deck that really gives it a trouble, and again, it just doesn't want to play a late game with the Nadu deck, so if they're able to just kind of go up the board, or you can't really get to the board that quickly as the Boros Energy deck, I think eventually the Nadu deck can win those long games and can just, again, be kind of a menace to what you have going on. So you definitely don't want to get trapped into long games with Nadu. But with that said, I think Boros Energy in the post-Nadu world is going to be one of the best decks, if not the Mardu version. I think Mardu might potentially be right up there with the Boros Energy, just because the Orcish Bowmaster and some of the Chthonian Nightmare flips are going to be really good, and I think the Mardu Energy has a pretty good matchup against Boros Energy, just because I think of the grindiness, and of course now the addition of Nyxlis as well kind of gives it that factor of like maybe playing more of like a mid-range strategy, playing more towards like the late game, but definitely still has a lot of the options that the Boros Energy deck has to kind of win the early game. Just Boros Energy can, I think, do it a little bit faster on average than what the Mardu deck can do, and the Mardu deck is a little bit more susceptible to getting Blood Moon and being locked out of having white mana or even black mana as well, which then kind of defeats the purpose of playing black because you're playing it for the powerful black cards on the deck. But, that's the Boros Energy deck. Let's go ahead, take a look at one more deck. The deck that you're probably least likely to see, but I still think is a very dangerous deck that you have to be aware of in this modern season. So the last deck we need to look at is Mono Black Necro, and this is kind of like rounds out what I think are the tier 1 decks of the modern format. So Mono Black Necro is based around the card Necro Dominance. For triple black, a legendary enchantment, you skip your draw step. At the beginning of your end step, you may pay any amount of life. If you do, you draw that many cards. Your maximum hand size is 5, and if a card or token would be put into your graveyard from anywhere, exile it instead. So while years past, like back in the day with like Necropotence, you wanted to draw over your hand size by like a few cards, so you had some options because you weren't going to get a draw step either. So it was like basically drawing back up to 7, and then you got to look at like a few other cards like your draw step, so then you could potentially get some more cards later. Necro Dominance, that is especially the case because you're not going to be able to trigger this until the end step, where at least on the Mono Black Necro decks of the past, you're able to, add more cards later if you needed to, but you definitely wanted to kind of like have your other turn mapped out. You want to make sure you hit your land drops. This deck sort of kind of the same way. The maximum hand size of 5 is annoying, but there's some ways to play around it thanks to these cards, Soul Spike and March of Wretched Sorrow, which allow you to pitch black cards to them to give you kind of an added benefit, where March of Wretched Sorrow makes the spell cost 2 less to cast for each black card that you exile with it, and you get able to deal X damage to target creature, planeswalker, and gain X life being the important thing. And Soul Spike, of course, getting to remove 2 black cards from your hand rather than paying its mana cost, which allows you to deal 4 damage to target creature or player, and then you gain 4 life. This is sort of kind of the way that you can kind of close out the game, thanks to cards like Shieldred. You have Grief plus things like Malakir Rebirth, where you're able to essentially scam your opponent and put pressure on them while also kind of digging for Soul Spikes to end up closing out the game. Thanks to Soul Spike and March of Wretched Sorrow gaining you life as well. When you get to your next end step, you're able to end up drawing more cards. In combination with Shieldred, you're able to, essentially, if you draw 5 cards, you're going to lose 5 life to draw 5 cards, but then you're going to gain 10 life, so you're going to net 5 life for each of those cards. Just remember it is a trigger, so you can't draw, equal to your life total and then expect Shieldred to save you because it'll be too late then. You have cards like Bogart Trawler and Fell the Profane, while they're kind of overcosted, like a removal spell, and then Bogart Trawler exiling a player's graveyard, which is a nice utility, but for 3 mana it is quite a bit. They do have the benefit of being lands that come into play untapped, and they are black cards, so you're able to play 13 actual lands and then have 12 double face cards, thanks to also having 4 Malakir Rebirth. This deck is a well-oiled machine because you are very likely to just draw a bunch of cards and always have black cards to exile with Soul Spike and to exile with March of Wretched Sorrow to kind of get you down to that 5 cards in hand, or discarding, essentially less cards to, ensure that you don't lose kind of like the value too much from, because they're going to get exiled anyway. So exiling those cards with Soul Spike or March of Wretched Sorrow is totally fine. You look at the sideboard, you have like Dauthi Voidwalker, you have Break the Ice for the, the colorless land decks, like, aka, Mono Green Tron and Eldrazi Tron. You have like Cling to Dust and Surgical Extraction for a little bit of graveyard hate. You have Thought Seizes to be a little bit more of like this kind of mid-range deck, which this deck does play mostly like a mid-range deck. Necro Dominance is not necessarily needed to make this deck good, but it is a way that you just like bury your opponent, where you're just able to get something big off the board with a March of Wretched Sorrow and then Soul Spike your opponent's face, even hitting their creatures, because again, like Shieldred herself, Grief, even like Bogart Trawler and Orcish Bowmaster are going to help kind of close out games to where you don't need all 4 Soul Spikes to go to the face. You can use them to kind of do some damage control to the board. You have Force of Despair is like a way that you can interact with a Nadu deck a little bit better, which is neat. Same with like Plague Engineer. You just name like Insect, and then they don't have an insect that can ever stay on the battlefield. Toxic Deluge, you can pay 3 mana and some life, and you can give creatures -X to where you can just deal with some of the creatures on the board. And Shieldred, having a lot of toughness, is able to kind of live a Toxic Deluge to then kill like a Nadu as well. This deck, I don't think you're very likely to see, because it is so much more expensive than some of the other decks. It's like $400 or $500 more than something like a Boros Energy, which you could argue is also like pretty good in the format. It's like $400 more than Jeskai Control, which we said in the short term is probably the best like counter to playing against Nadu. and is also kind of a tier 1 deck going forward. If you have, like, this is by no means a bad deck. I think it's going to be solidly a tier 1 deck, maybe a tier 1.5 deck through the entirety of the modern RCQ season, depending on obviously what we get from, you know, potentially the Duskborn set or whatever it is that's going to be coming out like just before the Pioneer Regional Championship. But Mono Black Necro is a very powerful deck. You kind of have to be aware of what is going on here, because once they get a Necro Dominance in play, know that you can interact with it. It does trigger at the beginning of the end step, of like your opponent's end step in this case. So if you're able to, in like the second main phase, you know, use a Beseiju to get rid of it, Force of Vigor, or anything like that to get rid of Necro Dominance, you're going to be in pretty good shape, especially if they kind of like dump their hand to kind of set up for a Necro Dominance is where you can kind of get them. But that being said, like once the Necro Dominance is down, you want to do kind of damage control from there. You want to get this off the board as fast as possible. And if you're just not able to adequately interact with a Necro Dominance that's in play, it's going to eat you alive, and eventually it will kill you. You just kind of have to hope that the Necro Dominance player gets a little loosey-goosey with the amount of cards they end up drawing, not necessarily making their life total low, but making like their library count pretty low, to where, you know, like sure they cast a ton of Soul Spikes, but if they're going at like your creatures, then and maybe they're not like hitting their land drops, or they're just not doing some of the like the due diligence things you should be doing with this Necro Dominance card. You can kind of steal some games that way, but more than likely they're gonna know really what's going on. Maybe that happens every once in a while, but you are going to be able to, you know, kind of do your thing with this deck and against it. So that's Mono Black Necro. That's the essentially kind of your primer for the modern format. Some tips and tricks and everything like that you're going to need to know for this modern RCQ season. I wish you all good luck in your events, as again, as of the release of this video, they're going to start this Friday and go on for the next few months to qualify for regional championship in Portland, Oregon, or Charlotte, North Carolina. As always, if you're not already subscribed to the channel and you want to see more videos from me, where again, we focus a lot on the modern and pioneer format and some other long form videos, again, please consider subscribing, supporting me and my content as we again race to 1,000 subscribers. I'm looking to do some very special things, so if you want to be a part of any of that, you know, you have to subscribe, and of course be on the lookout for some updates as we kind of go forward. And I want to get this stuff going, so please consider doing so. But yeah, that's gonna do it for me in this video. Hope you all enjoyed it, and I hope to see you all in the next one.